And thank you very much indeed for joining us today. We're just going to wait a little while more of the attendees get brought into the room. Excellent. Well, I'm going to make a start. There's still a few more people joining us, but I think by the time I've made my introductions, we'll be ready to go. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about sustainability in the business aviation sector. And anyone in this industry who wants to remain viable for the long term clearly needs to be engaged with the technology, the supply chain, and the business models that will be needed to safeguard the industry's environmental sustainability. We've made a strong start, a strong commitment to achieving this, I believe, and that was demonstrated very strongly at last month's Summit on Sustainability, which discussed the pathways to accelerating the market for sustainable aviation fuels. The cleaner burning alternative fuel that on a gallon by gallon basis can often reduce net life cycles carbon dioxide emissions of in excess of 50% compared with conventional jet fuel. And we're going to talk about that more in a moment. The summit demonstrated the unity of purpose between the industry groups, NBAA, GAMA, NATA, EBAA, IBAC, and CAFE, as well as the experts in the sustainable aviation fuel value chain, such as manufacturers, producers, providers, and FBOs, as well as operators and government leaders. There's clearly no one silver bullet solution, but in the short to medium term, at least, it seems that sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF as we now call it, is the most direct path to reducing the industry's carbon footprint. So today we're going to hear from two companies who are leading the way in this exciting field. And I'm very pleased and proud to say that joining us is our kind sponsor, Avfuel, a leading supplier of fuel and services. And Keith Sawyer, who's here with me, heads up the group's alternative fuels activities. And he sits on the Sustainable Fuel Environmental Coalition Steering Group, chaired by NATA, GAMA, NBAA, IBAC, EBAA, and CAFE. Thanks for joining us, Keith, and alongside us is also Mark Masluch. He's Director of Communications and Public Affairs with Bombardier Aviation, and he sits on GAMA's Environmental Committee. So both of these gentlemen are going to be very keen to answer your questions, and you'll be able to quiz them a little later on in our session. We look forward to having your questions. Please just type those questions into the webinar question field, and we'll address them at the end of the session. But first, I've got a question for all of you. So let's please start by responding to the poll that's going to appear on your screen in a moment. So the question is, has your company set specific goals for reducing carbon emissions in your operations? And this is interesting. It's a pretty even split so far. We're almost there. Good heavens, that's close. Very close. Just tipping the balance in favor of people saying yes, their company has set specific goals for reducing carbon emissions in their operations. And that's slightly increasing. We've now got 54% of people saying that and 46% saying no. So that's very, very interesting. Clearly, I would imagine that's why a lot of people have tuned in today. And Keith, let's start, please, with some basics. When we talk about sustainable aviation fuel, Just how sustainable is it? What's it actually made of? Why is it more sustainable than fossil fuel? Perhaps you could just elaborate a little bit more on this for the benefit of those who are not as exposed to this yet.
Thank you, Charlie. That's a great question, and I want to thank AIN for inviting Avfuel to participate. My colleague Mark Masluch, I've worked with numerous times, and this is quite a good opportunity for us to continue the journey and educational experience around SAF. The key component is this chart that's on the screen right now, which contrasts the life cycle greenhouse gas reductions for SAF compared to petroleum-based aviation fuel on the left. Sustainable aviation fuel has an unlimited resource in CO2, which is, in our atmosphere and so forth. And over the life cycle for the production of SAF, there are just some significant opportunities and actual and proven resource reductions from SAF and SAF use of between 70 and 80% over the life cycle. So I'm not talking just about the emissions from the aircraft as it's flying, but over the life cycle of that feedstock. Now, the second component of your question, Charlie, was the feedstocks and the various pathways that are attributable to the production of SAF. Well, there are currently 7 methodologies or pathways that have been approved and recommended by the FAA, international organizations, as well as the ASTM. Highly regulated, highly tested, all proven up to certain guide limits as far as the blending component of SAF that would be blended with the refined jet. Notwithstanding, the life cycle reduction in emissions is in that range of 70 to 80% as we speak today. The pathways are varied. We have wood waste pathway being developed in Oregon by a company. We have municipal waste being used by a company. We've got purpose-grown crops that are being used. And of course, the majority of what's being used today and incorporated into SAF and SAF consumption is used oils and residues that are produced under pathway number 2, which is the HEFA pathway. And I think it's really important that people just understand that it's the life cycle that's yielding this CO2 reduction as we go forward.
Absolutely, not just the fuel going straight into the aircraft. We've got to see the big picture here. That makes sense. And before we switch to Mark, Keith, in the big picture, just how close are we getting to sustainable aviation fuel being a truly viable option for business aircraft operators? I mean, in the next 12 to 24 months, can operators really expect to see availability increase? And perhaps you could just mention some of the steps that you at Avfuel are taking to increase the supply.
Well, thank you. We've had a number of demonstration events based on the SAF that we've contracted to purchase from Gevo, a company that produces the alcohol to jet under pathway number 5 in Texas from various purpose-grown crops and so forth. It's been very, very successful. The technology is there, Charlie. We have 7 pathways, multiple feedstocks, all which can yield the reductions that we're looking for through the production and the life cycle of SAF. So it's not close, it's here. The challenge is getting things to scale. And scale is very important, and we'll be talking about some of the economic variables later in the discussion today. But we forecast at Avfuel that by 2030, and this is in line with other industry predictions, that 10 to 15, perhaps 15 to 20% of the jet fuel consumed in the United States and North America can be or have an SAF component. At present, business aviation is around 1.5 billion gallons of jet fuel consumption within a total in North America of around 27 to 28 billion gallons. Globally, it's about 90 to 95 billion gallons. It's proven technology. The OEMs, my colleague Mark will talk about that in a moment. We've had in excess of 250,000 flights using a component of SAF and blends ranging from 5% to 100%. So it's
Yeah, that's
not a
great.
matter of when, it's if. I'm sorry, it's not a matter of
It's a
if,
matter
it's a
of
matter
if.
of when is
Right.
here.
And the
We
when is now, by the way, from
projects,
what you're
we
saying,
have
which is very encouraging.
many projects lining up to begin production.
Good. So, Mark, let's switch to your side of the equation. At Bombardier, you make aircraft. How ready are your aircraft to use this fuel? And perhaps you could give us some idea of what you and other manufacturers are doing to encourage operators to make this change.
Well, I think the most important point is that, SAF is drop-in ready. So the aircraft doesn't know the difference chemically from the regular fuels. But right now, it's also listed in all our aircraft manuals. What we found is when we began this journey to encourage operators to switch to SAF where it was available, safety was really the primary concern for, does it contaminate my fuel system? Does it contaminate the engines? And really, through GAMA and through the SAF coalition, we kind of banded together to put out material really specifying from an OEM manufacturer perspective, from an engine manufacturer perspective as well, that this is completely safe. The aircraft doesn't know the difference, and it can be taken on mixed with regular fuel if you're having a top up at an FBO or throughout operations where it would be available. So really our first and foremost responsibility from a manufacturer's perspective was to really drive this education that the fuel itself is the same, certified to the same AFDM standard, and ready to use and makes an impact today. Now it's really about helping promote the adoption and distribution. So we're obviously championing it and calling for it. Obviously, there's a lot of infrastructure that's going behind it as well. But from an education perspective, safety of the fuel and the drop-in ready component of it was the key part that we've been communicating these past 3 years.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And Keith, in your view, what sort of measures do you think are most likely to increase the use of sustainable aviation fuel? And what impact do you think market-based measures like book and claim could have? Perhaps you could just describe that to us.
Well, I think all of the components that you've articulated, Charlie, will have an impact in the future on the consumption, the production, and the blending. I think Mark hit on something there. The infrastructure is really going to be very, very important, and have the supply chain for SAF integrated into the typical jet fuel supply infrastructure that we have in the aviation business. Typically, you've got refineries to storage to aircraft. Now we need production of SAF, we need blending, we need certification, and then recertification to jet fuel. Those are another complex element in the supply chain that at Avfuel we're endeavoring to make sure is in place and is handling everything in a very safe manner. And we've been able to prove the supply chain, so the supply chain works. We have SAF now going to SFO, LAX, and a myriad of airports in Europe. And so that piece is complete. I think from a legislative point of view, on a regulatory basis, on a global basis, particularly here in North America, I think there are going to be a number of various incentives, tax regulations I'll talk about in a minute. Book and claim is one of them. And book and claim basically is, we as a supplier can sell you SAF, quote, in New York. It's not actually in your aircraft, but we put it into the general aviation, business aviation fuel supply chain in California, where it ultimately is being manufactured because of the incentives that are in California that make it a very, very economic or relatively good economic proposition versus other areas. Oregon has the same environment. So I just think that there's a number of market-based measures. Book and claim is going to be one thing, but I'll remind our audience that book and claim will be dependent upon the ultimate volume of neat SAF that is produced. You can't book and claim if you don't have the production, and you can't supply the molecules unless you have the production. So both will work.
Just to be clear, with book and claim, I want to make sure I heard that right. Is that like a sort of an offsetting program where you're sort of paying for sort of hypothetical fuel that you might have used, or perhaps I've misunderstood that?
No, it's not an offset program in the strict regime. In fact, a company, a corporate flight department, purchases FBO, purchases SAF as an example in New York. they actually buy it there, but they take receipt of it through their obligation that they've created, and they get credit for creating that obligation by having someone like Avfuel inserted into the supply chain in California. They get a certificate. They can then take that CO2 reduction and integrate it into their various scorings that I'll talk about in a little while.
Very good.
And it's important to look at it as something in between the actual use of SAF and an offset, because from a planetary perspective, simply put, if you're taking off from New York or LA, the atmosphere won't know where the SAF is being burned. What matters is that globally, regular fuel was replaced with SAF somewhere in our biosphere.
Yeah, and I think an important build on that for the audience is that it saves then the transportation from a California manufacturing facility to a location in Montreal, for example, because you would get the quote, the California economics for the product without having to transport it, and then ultimately retard some of the savings in the life cycle that have been incurred through the manufacturing of the SAF.
Yeah, that's a great point. So very real outcomes there, which are good for the planet, which is what we're here for today, ultimately. And Mark, you've been involved in some of the policy work on business aviation's environmental initiatives. Could you just tell us what role you think could be played by legislative incentives at a national, a state, or a local level to increase use of this type of fuel, and what sort of policy roadblocks could stand in the way? What steps do we have to take to make this as straightforward as it can be?
Well, I think like many policy matters that impact aviation, standardization is really the key aspect. So to be able to fly from one jurisdiction to another and be able to receive the same benefits for the use of SAF, from an operator perspective, from a manufacturer perspective who are using SAF and repositioning aircraft and demo operations, it's important that it be unified amongst jurisdictions. At the same time, from a production perspective of SAF, certainly, more widespread standards, unified standards that help encourage local production to do exactly what Keith mentioned in terms of reduce the dependence on creating CO2 by transporting the SAF from points of production that are perhaps more stimulated economically than others to grow feedstocks or other pathways for SAF. So I think that standardization is really the key enabler to this being accepted in a lot of geographies.
Yeah, that's good. And in terms of what you hear from policymakers in North America and other parts of the world, do you feel that there is a sort of growing consensus that this is something that is worthy of legislative focus, if you like?
I think there's definitely pockets, certainly.
I think we've lost your audio there, Mark. Mark, I think we've lost your audio. I'm very sorry. Keith, can I switch to you?
Yes, I'm here, and then we'll get Mark.
We'll try and get Mark back again. Keith, some people say it's quite costly to produce and distribute sustainable aviation fuel around the world, and they say, well, can the industry really afford this? What's your response to that, and are there steps being taken to improve that? And Mark, we'll get back to you in a moment.
Well, Charles, you're correct. SAF is more expensive, even when blended, and again, dependent upon the blend ratio, which is typically settling in between the 30 and 35% of neat to refined. It is more expensive, approximately 2 times to 2.5 times more expensive on a blended basis. The key component, though, notwithstanding the price delta of, let's say, $1 to $1.50 per gallon against current refined jet prices on the West Coast here, is that it may be more expensive, but when you consider the value that the use of SAF by a corporation within its environmental safety and governance scoring and its CI index scoring as a corporation is going to be very, very important. So there is a premium to be paid for the SAF. However, I think that premium can be absorbed or accounted for within a corporation's metrics and their overall sustainability performance when they incorporate aviation into their business. So that's item number one. I also think that a balanced regulatory environment is going to go a long way to helping move the price of SAF to parity with jet fuel. Ultimately, we don't think it'll ever get quite to parity, but I think we've already seen the gap narrow in the past couple of years through the increased availability, and we forecast even closer parity as more and more production comes online. But I think having more states beyond Oregon and California adopt, such as potentially in New York and elsewhere, regulatory environments such as is in California with the low carbon fuel standard credit will further move the price needle closer to parity. And then you've got book and claim as well, because ultimately, if there's more demand, there'll be more supply, and the product can be supplied to a customer in New York, in California, where it's manufactured at a lower cost, versus a regulatory environment that doesn't provide that incentive and that price subsidy, if you will, for reduced CO2 emissions.
Yeah, no, that's clear, and I'm glad to see we've got Mark back. Mark, just before the gremlins got the better of your wireless earphones, you were telling us about the political, the legislative environment, and I think you were saying there are sort of encouraging pockets where people do seem to be getting it, but then perhaps it's not a universal picture.
And hopefully you can hear me better now.
Perfectly. Yep.
Wonderful. Yeah, exactly. The standardization has to reach national and international levels. I think the more people demand SAF in terms of the operators at the end point and phone their local governments to say this is a real path, this has a real impact on our emissions as an industry, even though we are a very small portion of worldwide emissions business aviation, that is, it will help promote that growth, because the pathways exist in many jurisdictions. You're not looking for kind of a Goldilocks climate to get SAF. There are many pathways, and in fact there have been added pathways since we started this journey. We went from 5 to now 7 that are approved, so that can only continue growing.
Yeah, no, that's very good to hear. Very good to hear.
And I will compliment Mark's comments. Both in Canada and the US, there have been legislative initiatives at a federal level proposed around SAF incentives, SAF depreciation credits, other mechanisms that would allow for the manufacturing of SAF to be more competitively viewed, and rebalancing the renewables table from renewable biodiesels over to renewable jet fuels. Those are key rebalancings that we see needing to occur both in Canada and in North America to help get SAF further along the supply chain.
Yeah, good point, Keith. And before we move on, just quickly, we've understandably been talking a lot in the North American context, but I know in Europe, where I am, people are increasingly anticipating being able to use this fuel. So Keith or Mark, what's your sort of prognosis as to when the infrastructure may get beyond North America?
Well, I'll kick it off here. And Mark will be familiar with this, that some of their aircraft, in flying over to some of the international aviation events, were able to be fueled in Europe with SAF. SAF has been supplied to Scandinavian and some North European countries such as the Netherlands, Belgium, and the Scandinavian countries now for a number of years. And there are mandates now prescribed in the Scandinavian countries and some other European countries for the use of SAF to certain percentages. And we're also seeing components of the aviation sector mandated for use in Europe for SAF, such as the military, and integrating SAF into military use of aviation.
Yeah, good point. Mark, are you seeing global momentum here? Is this we're no longer going to be just saying this is a California thing? This is going places by the sound of it.
I think Europe has a very strong legislative path to making this a day-to-day reality. Help from the airlines is also pushing governments along to get larger quantities of SAF to airport hubs. So the business aviation industry certainly has to work in concert with that deployment to have offtake agreements from larger airline hubs to the smaller airports that business aviation depends on. But the global trend hopefully is starting, and certainly this year, just the amount of offtake agreements that were announced on a larger scale is certainly encouraging, and those are originating for the most part in the US. OEMs on both sides of the ocean are getting on board with offtake for demonstration activities and beyond, deliveries even, but it's hopefully becoming a more global phenomenon as we move into next year.
Thank you very much. That's great. Well, we're going to move on in a moment. In fact, we're going to have our second poll question. But first, a reminder to the audience, I really want to get your questions answered. To be honest, it's far more important that we get your questions answered than my questions. And I'm very glad to see we've got a number of questions. But please take the time from the audience to add your questions, and we'll get to those. We've got these two experts here, and we want to get maximum possible use out of their knowledge. But let's just take a quick break and have a poll question. So whether you are an aircraft operator, an airport, or an FBO, tell us, are you planning to start using or increase your use of sustainable aviation fuel over the next 12 months? Yes or no? Let's see what the audience is telling us. This is looking more positive. Getting a flood of responses in. I think we are almost there. And this is interesting. Whereas we had a pretty even split for the first question, we've got almost 3/4 of people, about 72%, saying yes, they are planning to start using or increase their use of sustainable aviation fuel over the next 12 months, and just over a quarter saying not yet, we're not quite yet ready to do that. So Mark, before we get to some audience questions, let's just cover some other aspects of this, if we may. I understand, Mark, that you've been involved in some of the work on offsetting in the business aviation sector, and we touched on that earlier. And I know that Avfuel also offers customers carbon offsets on a per fuel basis. We can ask Keith about that in a minute. But what sort of impact, Mark, do you think this would have, and what steps are being taken to make this practice more widespread?
I think it's also an education aspect. When we look at offsetting in the greater scheme of the business aviation commitment to climate change, it really appears as a temporary measure while we achieve true carbon reduction from technology, from engines, from more efficient airframes, performance-based approaches, and of course the largest wedge or chunk of that reduction comes from SAF. So offsets should always be looked at as a complement to a real, no-kidding carbon reduction initiative within an organization. But at the same time, they are a quick way to participate in being more sustainable. That said, SAF has the benefit of being approved at a regulatory level, one for one, with regular fuel in terms of its use. Offsetting has I guess a larger kaleidoscopic opportunity to participate, and you can participate in local offsetting or larger worldwide initiatives, or anything that's identified through CORSIA, so the real market-based measures offsetting organizations or affiliated organizations. So for an operator, there's a little bit more choice, but at the same time, we do want to push more people to SAF and to perhaps uptake in that way, because it provides real world reductions using your tank, whereas offsets, you purchase them and there's an initiative somewhere further down the road that contributes to a net carbon reduction. So we do always position SAF as the first thing you should look at as an organization, and then complement that with a suite of offsetting. And if you have a larger industrial setup from an FBO, for an aircraft manufacturer, for instance, you do also want to look at net carbon reduction schemes for your operations, but also then in your product build, which perhaps we can touch on later.
Yeah, good point. So although, offsetting is less direct than actually starting to use the fuel, I suppose we can say that it's somebody who's doing that is at least getting in the mindset that that's the direction of travel they should be on. And quickly, Keith, Avfuel offers carbon offsets on a per flight basis. Could you just explain how that works in practice and what sort of response you've seen to that?
We've seen a strong response to carbon offsets and the awareness of carbon offsets in business aviation after the leadership in some areas of the commercial business. For example, Delta or United Airlines can offer a passenger an offset scheme for their seat offset. We offer offsets on a per gallon basis, on a line item basis on your invoice. When you plan your flight, we issue the release. It can show that you've purchased an offset for that flight based on the number of gallons that you anticipate consuming. However, I'll build on Mark's view, and we are a strong proponent of SAF, the actual molecule, and/or transacting that molecule through book and claim or on a full load delivered basis. However, carbon offsets are something that I think in the more short to intermediate term will be very satisfactory. And it's one way for a business aviation element of a business that may exist already. And I'll take, for example, FedEx. They have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of trucks that they may offset those emissions for the gasoline, the diesel, and or the natural gas that is being used in those vehicles in generating emissions. So they may offset that, but they could extend their offset program into their aviation segment, and they probably have. But there are a number of ways for a company to increase their overall CO2 and their CI and their ESG score by reducing emissions through the purchase of offsets.
Yeah, fair enough. That's interesting. Mark, just quickly, the debate over what constitutes sustainability is not static. It keeps moving on, and there are different elements that get introduced. Can you just give us some idea of what else may now be expected of our industry in terms of what it can do to be more sustainable right through the supply chain, beyond just perhaps include raw materials used in aircraft, for instance? And what is the significance of environmental product declarations? I've heard about these. What sort of response should and is the industry making to those?
Well, the environmental product declarations are something that's relatively new to aviation. It's something that really is pulled from the consumer good world. So for instance, a telephone that you use on a day-to-day basis would have this environmental product declaration by the manufacturer, which really looks at what it takes to get the product delivered to a customer or an end user, starting from the sourcing of any raw materials in terms of process and the material itself and the impact on the world. So when we talk about the product life cycle from a sustainability perspective, the EPD actually measures what it takes to go from raw material to the built product, measure the life cycle CO2 emissions of that product. So for aircraft, of course, because they're burning fossil fuels or alternative fuels, there is CO2 emitted, and then what it takes to recycle that product. And that's something that, the more savvy consumer who's looking at consumer goods with that perspective, and we see that more and more, especially with cars, with phones, and with other large goods, they do use that as a measuring stick in terms of, is this the right product to buy? Am I contributing to the world? Am I taking away from it? And it's something that we've noted is very important in terms of showcasing the ability to be transparent in the impact of our products. And especially if you're looking to offset or really contribute to a net carbon reduction, you have to start from a base. And the EPD helps you create that calculated, transparent base for what a product in the real world contributes from a carbon dioxide perspective.
Yeah, very good point indeed. Keith, I've got another question for you, but I'm seeing quite a healthy crop here of audience questions, and I think we should jump into those so that we don't risk running out of time.
Sure.
So in no particular order, I've got a question here that actually relates to helicopter operations, but I think the point that the questioner is making could actually relate to other aircraft types. So I'll get to Mark in a minute. But Keith, the question I've got here is, I've received concerns from helicopter operators about the sensitivity of their sensors to sustainable aviation fuel. So when speaking of blends that make up sustainable aviation fuel, can you address any concerns of helicopter engine companies who are on the books in addition to other OEMs and who may be looking to make use of these fuels? Are you aware of any such concerns like that?
We are aware of those concerns, and we continue to monitor that very closely. We have a number of customers that are flying helicopters that have asked me this very question, Charlie. And the first response that I typically have is, please check with your manufacturer and check your owner's manual to see if in fact they have done that and incorporated SAF into the fuels component like Bombardier have done for their fixed wing aircraft. I know the fixed wing teams are all well in line and so forth. Another suggestion is to contact GAMA, the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, who pay very close attention to this matter. We've supplied some SAF, some of the neat SAF, to several of the engine manufacturers for rotor aircraft, for helicopter aircraft, and they continue to do their evaluations. But I'm not a technical person, so to speak, but I am aware that a number of helicopter operations have flown on SAF. But my first coach to the question and the person who's asked the question is to contact their engine manufacturer for their helicopter first, and then move forward from there. Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. And Mark, I'm sure you would endorse that as an OEM. I'm sure that as you prepared to establish that your aircraft could operate on this fuel, your engineers considered all aspects of that in terms of possible damage to systems.
Well, absolutely, and that was really the base exercise when we put out the first guide to sustainable aviation fuel, along with the other OEMs, was the Bombardier and the engine manufacturers of the world, as well as the other aircraft manufacturers, saying that not only do we endorse the use of this in our products, we've committed to put it in our reference manuals and formal procedures. On top of now, for companies like Bombardier, offering it through their demo operations and aircraft delivery facilities.
Yeah. Okay. Good. That
and
makes
Charlie,
sense.
a final reminder there is that the blended product, when it's delivered, the supplier, the reseller, Avfuel, certified that meets 1655. So in effect, it is jet fuel, but that nuance of that specific question needs to be researched specific to that engine manufacturer by the helicopter operator directly.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Keith, another direct question, I think this time for you at Avfuel. Based on the increased demand for sustainable aviation fuel around the world, is Avfuel's evaluating other regions outside North America where they would like to develop SAF capabilities?
The answer is yes. We're monitoring international availability of SAF and SAF on a blended basis in a very keen manner. In fact, this morning there were a number of announcements in the Biofuels Digest about Shell making some arrangements in Europe. We had a parliamentary discussion in the UK around 7 hubs related to SAF and where SAF would be produced. Velocys were part of a major, and they're a producer potentially with British Airways in right near where you are in the UK, Charlie.
Yeah.
That also made some announcements and so forth. So in addition to what Neste is doing in a very dominant manner in Scandinavia and making it available through Europe, Total have initiatives. There's just a range of initiatives that are underway, and we're following them quite closely because we're seeing a demand from business aviation through our fixed-based operators and our customers for SAF.
Yep, good. Okay. And one more question for you, Keith, and then we've got a couple of questions about book and claim that we're going to bring up. But Keith, somebody's asking here, when it comes to sustainable aviation fuel production, what do you see as the most challenging cost issues? Is it the overall research and development costs for these fuel? Is it the fluctuating feedstock prices? You know, what's going to shape the pricing structure most?
I think the pricing structure ultimately will be defined by the availability at scale and on a commercial basis of the SAF. As I mentioned earlier, we predict between 10, 15, 20% by 2030 of the jet fuel in North America may have an SAF component, just depending upon where we get to. But there are numerous projects underway that are now seeking either financing or they're getting very close to production. The Oregon project, the Reno project with Fulcrum, the Red Rock project, Neste are now in business on the West Coast. World Energy have been in business for some time. There are enough projects in the queue that I don't think it will be so much the supply of the neat SAF that's available, but the associated infrastructure and the regulatory environment around a blender's tax credit, which is now being discussed in Washington through our associations with the governments, and extending that from the biodiesel market into the SAF market for the blending. And then, as I say, it's trying to identify where SAF can be blended with refined jet, because right now the methodology is it needs to be blended off airport, shipped to the airport, and then consumed.
Yeah, good point. Mark, a couple of questions about book and claim. First of all, just a clarification, when using book and claim, who gets the credit for the carbon reduction? I think we touched on that, but let's just be really clear on that.
So depending on how you're using your book and claim and with who, the point of purchase, the claim should come to the operator. If you're purchasing it through an FBO directly from the fuel provider, each system will be tailored to that particular point of purchase. But at the end of the day, the SAF being used is the benefit of the process. And Keith and Avfuel obviously have their own specific system for booking claims and passing on the ultimate benefit to the operator.
Yeah, good point. And another questioner is saying, and we touched on this to some degree, is book and claim going to continue to be a major part of the fueling logistics process if manufacturers and operators are too far, if manufacturers of the fuel are too far from where an operator is, or is this just an interim step, if you like, until the fuel supply can get further? And either of you can take that one if you like. Keith, have you got any comments on that?
My comment is that, book and claim we see as a longer term and a viable solution to one, creating the demand, two, creating the production, and three, inserting the carbon savings and the emissions reductions into the business aviation supply chain. That's the ultimate goal. And book and claim is largely modeled after other book and claim commodities such as electricity, such as natural gas, and so forth. So it's not a new concept. It's taking an existing concept and applying it, as Mark indicated, to aviation and specifically business aviation, which would be a bit more complex because we have so many more locations than quote the commercial airlines have for the purchase of their fuels.
Yeah, good point. Okay.
Short term, it's going to be very important, and of course, long term, there's room for both. But as locations are still sparse around the world in terms of availability, book and claim certainly is one of the, I guess, the champion ways of participating in SAF propagation.
And book and claim volumes can only be met if the product is being produced so that it can be inserted into quote the claim side of the book and claim transaction.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, somebody's looking even more long term here, and this is a question that I have to admit was on my mind too. Mark, somebody's saying, won't sustainable aviation fuel become extinct or redundant when hydrogen and electric propulsion platforms are more readily available in the next 5 to 10 years. And that crossed my mind. If my next global 7500 aircraft is going to be a hydrogen powered one, then isn't sustainable fuel like this just a stopgap? And maybe that's not a bad thing.
Philosophically, I think it's the right way to think about it. That said, when you get down to the reality of production and propulsion of these platforms, it's a question of when can the energy density match the requirements. So the Global 7500 is a great example. You're pushing more than a dozen passengers and crew 7,700 nautical miles at high Mach halfway around the world. The batteries required to do that today don't exist. There's a lot of great initiatives to electrify smaller aircraft, eVTOLs, we've seen a lot of that, but the fundamental market of making the world a smaller place through aircraft like the Global 7500, the propulsion systems are more than 5-10 years away. We look at that scale in the 20 to 25 year development cycle, and we do have a plan to impact the environment and really the industry today and tomorrow, and that's why SAF is critical to doing that. We're talking about decades in terms of product development to get very long range aircraft electrified or alternatively propulsed, but at the same time, we have to fill, practically a generation's worth of carbon reduction before we get to that point. And we can't look at the future and say, well, one day we won't have combustion-based or fuel-based engines. We have to think about what's happening today, tomorrow, and in the next 5 years, and SAF is the path for that.
And I guess what we don't want to do is say, well, because perfection is going to be happening, let's just not do anything now. We
Exactly.
need to take these steps. So looking on timelines, Keith, somebody else is saying in 10 years from now or over the next 10 years, do you expect sustainable aviation fuel to be very widely used around the world? Do you think this is going to become not some sort of fringe fuel option, but actually fairly mainstream?
Yes, it will be mainstream, and we're strong advocates of that through the work that we're doing to ensure that we're ready both for the secured supply, the distribution, the blending, and availability of the various transaction mechanisms for our Avfuel customer base, and for those of others. And that's why we're very active in these legislative initiatives, the initiatives by our associations both in the EU and in North America, because we do see it as an element of the future. Will it ever be 100%? I don't know, but I know that a significant component beyond today by 2030 will be SAF within the fuel supply chain.
Good point. Okay. And a question here, I suspect from an FBO, they're asking if an FBO has a customer, meaning an aircraft operator, that doesn't want to pay for the sustainable aviation fuel, but the FBO is willing to supply that out of choice, can the FBO take the credit as the supplier?
I'd have to get back to that specific question on that for that customer, but ultimately it's going to be the consumer who will get the value of that credit, or the operator, as Mark referred to earlier.
Right. Okay.
But if the FBO is an airport, and the airport is a consumer of the fuel, such as we have a number of customers that have maintenance and service facilities with them. They may, as an FBO as well as a consumer, enjoy the value of those credits as an FBO, but they're not ultimately then reselling that product through their operations.
Yeah, good point. And I think we've got a related question here, Keith. So somebody is asking if a company charters a private jet and sustainable aviation fuel is put into that aircraft by the operator, in other words, the charter operator, can the credit be forwarded or given to the charterer of the aircraft rather than the operator of the aircraft? Can the end user be the ultimate beneficiary? It sounds like that is the case.
That is the case, but my coach would be for that questioner to work with their charter operator just to understand how that would all flow, because to Mark's earlier point, it is the operator who ultimately will enjoy the value. If that operator wishes to extend that value onto their charter partner, their charter customer, that would be a discussion between the charterer and the charter company.
Good. Well, it's good that we've got people's attention enough that they're already starting to think of the various permutations of how this market can work. And Mark, somebody's picked up on your earlier comments about the whole supply chain and the wider sustainability issue beyond just fuel. And they're asking, what happens at the end of an aircraft life cycle? Can you recycle or reuse components? And I would imagine this is something that has been on Bombardier's mind.
Absolutely, and if I look at the EPD of the Global 7500, recyclability is part of that. So looking down to, can you strip the aircraft down to the aluminum, and how do you recycle the aluminum? How much of the aircraft is indeed recyclable versus having to be properly disposed of from a chemical perspective, and are any of the components reusable? So that's something when we're looking at the life cycle through environmental product declarations that's very clearly listed in terms of how to tear down the aircraft and what parts of the metals are indeed recyclable, and how much of the aircraft is recyclable. And more we're looking at our product design in that light.
Good point. And somebody is considering the legislative environment and the fiscal environment, and they're saying, do we think that carbon taxes should apply to sustainable aviation fuels, or should this be part of the incentive equation where these fuels aren't taxed, whereas maybe carbon fuels are taxed? Have you heard much discussion of that, Mark?
Not at any, I guess, government levels, but it's something that we're obviously going to watch closely because incentivizing the fuel is really the key. But at the same time, we're looking at the pandemic that we're in, and we do also have to re-incentivize air travel. So there's a delicate balance to be struck. I don't know if Keith has a different perspective on that from the fuel from a fuel provider perspective.
Yeah,
yes, have you heard much of that?
It's something that we're monitoring. Taxes are just an element of the business that we monitor. But what we are seeing at the state level is these various credits and so forth that are available to the manufacturers that they can then claim and apply to the price of the neat product, which is then ultimately blended. So we are seeing that, and that is actually happening today in California and Oregon.
Yeah, good point. Keith, here's what I think is a very practical question. Somebody's asking, is there a published list of FBOs where sustainable aviation fuel is available? In other words, if you're an operator and you want to use this stuff, what's an easy way you can figure out where you can go to get it, especially at airports where maybe there are multiple FBOs and some may have it and some may not?
That's a terrific question, Charlie. And right now, the availability of SAF is very, very limited. It's more available on a demonstration type basis. But I would anticipate that over time, and I know we as Avfuel will identify those locations to corporate and business aviation where SAF will be available as we progress our SAF supply arrangements for SAF and its availability.
Good point. Another question here, I think, for Avfuels, but Mark may have something to say. Somebody is saying, has the US Department of Defense approached Avfuels to evaluate their current needs for fuel and perhaps increase use of fuels? And do you see that military market, Keith, as perhaps an early adopter?
The military were an early adopter of SAF, and in fact, they have flown a number of missions with their aircraft on various blends all the way up to 100% for several of the pathways. However, the military contracts are done through the government, and we've yet to see, and we're in the tender process now, and I would check with my commercial colleagues to see if in fact SAF is becoming a component of that tender process to the government, for example, the Air Force or the Navy, things of that nature. But as of yet, we've not seen a dramatic interest expressed by the military. The military volume in the U.S. is roughly the same as the business aviation volume in the US. And on a regulatory basis, they would be, a very easy adopter, because it could be then, as we're seeing in Europe, mandated. For example, several countries have mandated in Europe that their military will use a component of SAF, I think up to 5%. But we've not seen that in North America. And each of our FBOs, I know, has a relationship or provides feedback to us on their interest or what interest might have been expressed about the availability of SAF at their specific airport or specific military delivery point.
Yeah, fair enough. Mark, got a question for you here, and this is, going back to the different choices that people have in the market at the moment. The questioner is saying, Mark, if you had the opportunity to either uplift sustainable aviation fuel at an FBO at an airport versus doing book and claim at a different FBO at the same location, would it make sense for you to take the fuel directly or do the book and claim? I think I know the answer to that, but what's your response to that?
I think I mentioned earlier that if you're an operator or an end user, your kind of hierarchy of decision should be direct SAF in your tank, book and claim, and then offsets. That I think is the preferred decision matrix.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
support that.
Good. Okay, I'm just checking these questions. We've got time for a couple more, I think. Yes, a question is saying here that they believe there are quite a few pushbacks to some programs like book and claim and carbon offsets. I guess they mean objections as to how credible they are. Do you find yourselves having to address these concerns with consumers? Maybe Keith, you've heard about this, and do you sort of get involved in advocating the case for or against, or are you somewhat neutral on that?
Well, we will be an advocate of book and claim because we think it will then generate the demand and the supply of the molecules. And for ultimately the goal, the end game is to reduce the CO2 emissions from business aviation. And we're a strong proponent of that goal. So we will work to support and educate our customers and questioners on book and claim, as we have made so much progress just on educating people on the molecule. We've done a terrific job on that through the guide, through educational programs, through panels such as this, the summit several weeks ago in Washington, and other panels and so forth associated with business aviation activities and demonstration activities. Ultimately, it's an educational process, and I know that our associations are now developing a sort of a document, if you will, around the book and claim process, so that it's transparent and easily understood by people who are interested in pursuing that as an alternative to the molecule.
Yeah, good point. We've just time for a couple more questions, and these are sort of aggregated questions based on what a few people are saying in the chat panel. Mark, if I could ask, if I'm a business aircraft operator and I'm interested in what we're describing here today, what sort of steps should I be taking now to start using sustainable aviation fuel on a consistent basis? Apart from rushing out and buying a brand new Bombardier aircraft, of course.
Well, it should start with a brand new Bombardier aircraft, but that aside, it's really about understanding that from an operational perspective, depending on how your safety management system works, it'll blend right in. There's no extra steps needed to be taken to pump it into your aircraft. What you do need to do is make sure that you contact your fuel provider or your FBO or your primary source of fuel to understand what their options are for SAF. What Bombardier has encouraged everyone to do is ask for it. So when aircraft leave our facilities, we offer it. We have it in stock, but then the later life cycle of the aircraft is about each operator asking their fuel providers for how they can get it or how they can get their hands on a book and claim system. So there's no technical hurdles that need to be crossed. If you're operating a jet, you can drop in SAF. It's really a question of asking for it at every point that you operate.
Right, so very simply, consumers need to speak up and demand it, and helpful people like Keith and his friends at Avfuel will rise to that challenge by the sound of it. And Keith, conversely, if I'm an FBO or an airport, what steps should I be taking to be part of the solution in making sustainable aviation fuel more universally available? and viable?
Well, it will be the comparable answer to what Mark identified. Contact your fuel supplier, contact Avfuel, and we'd be happy to provide you with an update. And we're in the process and have been educating our FBOs on our plans and our goals and objectives and our role in helping them achieve either their airport, their corporate, or their FBO sustainability metrics on a going forward basis. We incorporate those requests and those demands ultimately into the portfolio of supply of SAF that we will secure and provide to our customer base.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. Well, gentlemen, I think on our current fuel reserves, we've answered about as many questions as we can realistically hope to get through, but I found that fascinating. I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope our audience have too. I'd like to thank the audience for those exceptional questions. They were very good, stimulating questions, and also special thanks to both Keith and Mark for sharing their knowledge with us today and their experience. I would just say this, NBAA and its partners have produced an excellent report called Fueling the Future. And if you go and look at that, you'll find plenty of very valuable further information. It's free to download. I know it's on the NBAA website. I'm not sure if we've got the link here. I think we might do in a minute. And sustainability is a key priority area of coverage for AIN's news reporters. So please do stay with us at ainonline.com. Barely a week goes by, we don't have a story about this, and I think that's only likely to increase. So once again, we appreciate everybody's participation today. We especially appreciate the generous sponsorship of Avfuel, and we're grateful for that. This webinar was recorded, and the recording will be shared with everybody who registered for it, I believe, tomorrow. If we didn't get to your questions, we're going to try and share those with our panelists, and we will try to get a direct response to you. So once again, everybody, thank you for your time. It's been great spending time with you.
And Charlie, thank you. Thank you very much for your capable facilitation, and to AIN and my colleague Mark for participating in this terrific educational opportunity. It was quite expansive and has given me some additional things to work on. Thank you.
There you go. Time well
Absolutely,
spent.
and we've well noted that the third version of the guide will have hopefully more points of contact for purchasing SAF itself. So we'll take that as an action on our side.
Excellent.
Yes.
Thank you all very
Thank
much.
you, Charlie.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.